Nobody was supposed to find it. The labyrinth designer was a secret class, buried so deep in the system that no hunter even knew it existed. He was just a volunteer gate closer, the guy they called when no one else wanted the job. No guild, no salary, no power. Then he stumbled onto something the entire hunter world had missed. But while every hunter in Korea was learning how to fight monsters, he was learning how to own them. While S ranks were burning through stamina in straight combat, he was collapsing entire dungeons on top of his enemies before they even knew he was there. The guilds couldn't track it. The elders couldn't stop it. This is the story of how a volunteer nobody with a class nobody knew existed became the most dangerous hunter in Korea. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and subscribe so you don't miss our next manhwa recap. The city's skyscrapers blazed with light above streets choked by streaking traffic. An ambulance tore down a rain-lashed highway, emergency lights flashing through the dark. 3 Korean hunters stood battered and breathless, saved only by Japanese S-rank reinforcements. Forum users raged online, mocking hunters' intelligence and accusing them of secret US payments. A man in orange slumped back, complaining it was absurd others earned more than him. The red-haired pilot gripped the controls, smirking as he claimed the finish line neared. A pink-haired man sat slouched in red light, smartphone in one hand, unreadable. A gloved thumb pressed a phone button, triggering a sharp click as it responded. The driver shouted they were nearing the chief, knuckles white on the wheel. 5 operatives rode tense in a speeding vehicle, one muttering they always drew curses. A man in a dark jacket rested his fist against his cheek, eyes closed softly. 3 armored men stood still beneath glowing guild emblems, casting long shadows. 3 department icons hung on wires, labeled with tools and functions, totaling 3. A bucket-hatted man sprinted in terror, yelling monsters chased them through smoke. A masked figure stood wreathed in purple energy, smiling faintly as power crackled. Glowing yellow eyes locked forward as purple energy flared around a cold-faced man. Golden energy erupted from a crouching man's hands, shattering brick beneath him. 4 soldiers braced under a pulsing rift, weapons raised as lightning arced forward. A gloved hand crushed a small object until it cracked audibly under pressure. 5 armored men stood ready in fiery haze, the lead warning to stay alert. 2 armored men tensed before a silver-haired figure in dim, watchful silence. A red-haired man stared sideways, expression unreadable under oppressive lighting. An overcross executive stood beside a younger man beneath their glowing emblem. 2 adventurers stood back-to-back amid snarling beasts, indifferent to deaths for profit. A silver-haired man smirked against crimson backdrop, declaring the game had begun. The armored man recoiled, shouting no one should push him, sparks flying at his feet. The silver-haired man smiled warmly, eyes closed, speaking calmly in soft daylight. Purple-haired man exhaled softly, a faint smirk playing on his lips. A golden-eyed man demanded to know what was hidden. The elder dismissed it calmly. A silver-haired figure watched 3 silhouettes enter a blazing orange portal. An elderly white-haired man grimaced, struck hard enough to echo nearby. Rain fell on a stone temple entrance, lanterns glowing through palm fronds. A green-haired figure pressed a glowing hand to another's chest, gasping power overflowed. A woman screamed as 2 red-eyed monsters loomed over her fallen, glowing comrade. A red-haired man stood frozen, bloodshot eyes wide, nose bleeding in shock. Clawed beasts shrieked downward, talons aimed at a cowering silent figure. Pink-haired characters squeezed shut their eyes, trembling as a tear fell. A dark object blurred across the frame with violent speed and impact lines. A blue-haired warrior drove a lightning-charged spear deep into a horned beast's chest. A spear wielder stood guard before a woman cradling an unconscious ally amid red flames. Blonde woman gasped something was wrong as a gloved hand snapped before her. A rescue worker announced their arrival, yellow eyes sharp against stark white backdrop. Brown-haired man shouted furiously, sweat beading near a glowing spear and sack. The brown-haired fighter yelled to find the source while standing over a dead monster. Glowing yellow eyes locked forward as motion streaks signaled sudden acceleration. Blue hologram clicked on, announcing the casting of Silent Wave. 2 yellow energy figures materialized on stone, vines creeping along ancient ruins. Spectral figures drifted through a mossy corridor as an unseen voice urged focus. 2 golden figures stood in a dungeon as an unseen presence vowed to map by sound. A pink rift hovered above stone, crackling yellow energy onto mossy cavern walls. A young man stared up, resolve sharpening as blue energy swirled a sealed door. An armored man lunged, shouting for others to move under ancient lantern glow. A blonde woman cried out, thrown over a man's shoulder in sudden motion. Armored fighters sprinted through forest, one shouting they were leaving now as beasts lunged. Ponytailed woman stared wide-eyed, sweating under creeping shadows and dim light. Brown-haired man glanced back, smirking, background blurred by rapid movement. A hooded man lunged forward, demanding his opponent come at him with crackling energy. A red-eyed beast roared forward in a blur, fangs bared with violent momentum. A red-cloaked mage channeled pink lightning into stone, fracturing ground with exertion. A light brown-haired man snarled they'd all die, sweat beating in thick air. Armored fighters braced against a horde, surging through a blood-red corridor. A scarred man gaped in shock as lightning flared behind him toward a looming shadow. A tactical soldier lunged with glowing sword at a woman, recoiling in green energy. A dark-haired youth dodged past a blue-scaled beast as crimson energy burst between them. A young fighter watched startled as blades clashed with a monstrous creature nearby. 5 blue-skinned ghouls grinned menacingly, horns curved amid eerie blue mist. Blue system window chimed, announcing sixth sense activation. A wounded fighter gripped a glowing shield, breathing hard against swirling red backdrop. A wooden pillar crashed down, exploding earth with violent purple energy. Adventurers stood in a purple circle as tendrils surged, and a boss lunged silently. A man shouted this was impossible, purple energy swirling around his armored collar. Purple armored man roared he wouldn't be stopped, eyes blazing gold and fury. A dark-haired man screamed as golden energy blasted from his mouth upward. A bandaged hand flexed near a chest, producing a sharp sound in stillness. 2 soldiers charged through violet energy, spears gripped with battle-ready expressions. An armored man lunged roaring he'd crush them all, face twisted in rage. A man screamed something was wrong as a projectile exploded against his shoulder. A hooded man lunged terrified as a spear-wielding woman struck from above. A young man crouched low, purple energy surging as dark particles swirled off him. A magenta system window declared movement speed, restricted against streaked white backdrop. A spiky-haired man screamed in agony as violet lightning racked his body. A dark figure faced armored warrior and beast as the leader vowed to protect the crystal. A reddish-brown-haired man reacted tense to an unseen threat against dark tiles. Blonde mage hurled blue lightning at beasts, shouting for everyone to move. An armored man stared wide-eyed, mouth open in shock at an off-screen threat. Character grimaced with clenched teeth, jagged sounds radiating from their jaw. A shadowed warrior reacted to 2 figures battling under pink light behind him. A golden-eyed man demanded they stop now as purple lightning crackled at his shoulder. A warrior stood defiant in a magic circle, spear raised against encircling beasts. A cloaked figure stood still in rain, declaring this was where it ended. Golden eyes narrowed with cold intensity, radiating silent menace forward. Caracal grinned skeletal, red eyes glowing as he declared his chilling name. A hooded figure raised a bandaged hand wreathed in purple lightning, unleashing dark power. A golden-eyed man smirked, declaring it was finally time to begin. A bandaged hand crackled with purple energy, fingers curling around unseen power. A masked soldier lunged, lower body dissolving into purple energy mid-charge. A gauntleted hand slammed down, erupting into dark explosion that shattered stone. System alerts flickered pink, declaring curse applied and vitality decreasing. A man screamed as purple energy surged through him, eyes white and darkness shattering. A grim-faced man glared ahead, while another readied a sword in purple light. A capped man screamed as red energy burst from his chest, scattering glowing coins. A horned demon snarled pinned on cracked stone, pink energy swirling its body. Colossal hero knelt in rain, placing hands on a boy's shoulders as savior. A gloved hand rested on the boy's head as golden eyes widened in surprise. A blindfolded hunter wept in rain, while another stared up under purple sky. A kneeling man held a boy's shoulders with solemn affection in stardust rain. A battered fighter screamed he couldn't die here as system windows activated abilities. A radiant figure stood amid electrical explosion, shadowy forms recoiling around golden petals. Golden lightning crackled across mossy ruins, illuminating archway with violent intensity. Golden arc shot down a stone corridor toward a distant figure before carved face. Golden lightning raced toward a glowing figure as a voice mentioned slim chance. A yellow eye crackled electric, radiating intense light amid vibrating dark streaks. A rune-covered monolith fractured apart, debris floating amid cascading data streams. Teal runes split marble as dark cracks spread with sharp impact sounds. Blue notification announced discovery of literature on a hidden class. Battered warrior gasped, clutching a blue shield as exhaustion trembled the air. A bandaged hand pulsed red energy, a deep crack splitting its ominous palm. A horned rider charged atop purple beast, red eyes glowing through dark energy. A warrior readied defense in magic circle as 3 monsters closed in violently. Blue prompt asked if recipient wished to change class to labyrinth designer. Violet-haired character stared shocked, golden eyes bathed in eerie purple light. A massive purple surge exploded into stone, shattering rock with brutal force. A red-haired man delivered flaming punch, shockwaves rippling through massive torso. Glowing yellow eyes burned with fury as red energy signaled power's imminent surge. A dark-haired man screamed accepting fate, purple energy swirling in anguish. A lone figure stood amid shattering ground as monsters fled a crimson slash. Blue interface announced tutorial commencement amid floating glyphs and sharp sound. A green-hooded character stood shocked as bright blue energy erupted erupted beside them. Floating blocks drifted through digital voids streaked with data and light particles. Bandaged claw dug into cracked stone, ringing out a sharp sound. The horned mage gripped his staff, 6 red eyes glowing beneath manic grin. A horned figure raised hands toward shifting data wall crackling with blue lightning. Blue-haired warrior stood stunned, dirt-streaked face frozen in wide-eyed silence. Seo Yul's holographic profile glowed with stats and skills against dark backdrop. Blue-haired man slumped against brick, weary as he touched a hologram. A scarred, golden-eyed man stared up demanding to know who was there. A misty hall stretched into shadow, checkered floor reflecting pink sconce light. Battered man stared shocked at rising blue hologram activating beside him. Quest interface displayed objective: eliminate 20 ghouls in 24 hours. Blue-haired man stared sideways in surprise amid purple-hued brick walls. A character clenched fist as cyan holograms swirled with cascading digital symbols. A tactical man exclaimed the holographic map was surprisingly detailed on hex tiles. A grid showed green diamond center. Unseen voice stated it marked current location. A green shard rested in digital arena amid red crystals and data streams. An eye glowed with blue-red reticle, locking onto an unseen target. A stern man stood arms crossed behind holographic maze, runes floating in dim chamber. A battered man exhaled heavily, faint smirk forming as he breathed ha. A confident man raised armored fist, declaring they should begin amid blue code. A mist-shrouded neon-lit alleyway stretched into the darkness, while wet pavement reflected faint pink glows from distant signs. A monstrous blue creature with glowing red eyes lunged forward in a blur, its maw wide open and radiating violent energy. The dark-haired warrior drove his glowing blue blade into the massive stone arm, shattering the surface with a violent impact. A glowing blue system notification declared that the level had increased, accompanied by a sharp chime and digital particle effects. A wounded man with purple hair clutched his arm and exclaimed that only 4 remained as the system displayed the count. A purple-haired man stood over the defeated monster, raised his blade, and stated that he could at least use this. A glowing golden eye crackled with lightning as the narrator stated they utilized the map skill. Red energy shards rained down upon the glowing science structure, an action that reduced the number of ghouls. The blue-haired fighter unleashed a blinding electric blast into the monster's chest, sending arcs of lightning crackling across its hide. A glowing blue system window displayed the remaining count and time, while narration stated confidence in finishing within the limit. The young man gripped a crackling blue energy blade as the display showed 10 ghouls remaining and 11 hours left. The young man in tactical uniform stood frozen before a towering, glowing blue spectral demon flickering against the brick wall. 5 glowing red crystals hovered within a teal hexagonal grid system. The young man with purple hair recoiled slightly as a gloved hand gripped his shoulder, his expression tense with alarm. A massive purple beast with glowing red eyes lunged forward, its horned head lowered as blood sprayed behind it. The young man with violet hair turned his head sharply and demanded to know who was there amidst sudden suspicion. The young man stared forward in tense silence as a hulking monster lunged through the mist behind him with scraping claws. The young man with dark hair lunged forward, extending both arms as jagged blue energy blades manifested from his gauntlets. A massive scaled foot with curved claws pressed down onto the tiled floor, echoing a sharp impact sound from the contact point. The young man with glowing yellow eyes stared forward and demanded to know who dared approach him in the shadowed alleyway. 4 purple-horned monsters loomed forward in menacing silence, their muscular forms radiating an aura of imminent violence. The young man stared intensely at the floating holographic interface and considered that this path would lead to disaster. The character stared forward with intense focus, while tension hung heavy in the air around them. The warrior in green armor slashed through a dissolving enemy midair, while 3 shadowy beasts reared up below. A glowing Chinese chessboard displayed strategic move paths under a dark sky, while an unseen voice cursed the lack of a solution. A cloaked figure lunged forward in a blue digital aura and declared it checkmate as a red entity recoiled behind barriers. The character gritted their teeth and clenched their jaw in frustration while suppressing a growl of anger. A monstrous beast lunged forward with claws extended and mouth open in a silent roar amidst a violent purple haze. The armored man clenched his fist and screamed that he needed something usable as data streams cascaded around him. 3 blue system windows activated silently to announce the casting of Silent Wave and the activation of 2 other skills. The masked figure in armor stood defiantly before charging monsters and shouted that anyone thinking they could kill him should try. A blue digital interface flickered with glitch effects as it announced the discovery of a spin block through linked skills. The young man raised both hands as swirling teal energy erupted around him, his expression twisted in furious concentration. A glowing blue system notification declared that the spin block could now be used through the map. The young man in futuristic armor extended his hand toward a glowing blue chest while activating the ancient mechanism before him. A green hexagonal hand cursor spun downward in a digital arena, triggering red energy bursts on the floor. The young man with purple hair extended his glowing hand forward in a defensive stance and demanded to know who approached. The dark-haired man looked up in shock as two monstrous, fanged beasts surged toward him from above, wreathed in energy. A holographic tactical display projected a hex grid battlefield with glowing red and green crystals marking opposing forces. The muscular armored figure lunged forward through a streaking teal energy field, limbs extended and body blurred by motion. The muscular horned creature lunged forward in a greenlit chamber, its clawed hand extended toward a fallen figure on the floor. A gloved hand crackled with blue energy as it hovered before a snarling, blood-smeared monster radiating primal fury. The man with purple hair smiled faintly while speaking, his expression calm yet subtly unsettling against the dim background. A hexagonal energy construct fired a green beam into the chamber, causing two monsters to recoil with glowing red eyes. The massive horned beast raised its claw toward a glowing teal barrier, causing bright sparks to erupt on impact. The masked fighter leaped forward with a glowing blue blade, striking toward two snarling beasts in the eerie green corridor. The blue-haired man channeled crackling electric energy through his arm, while shouting that he would not be stopped. The young man channeled crackling blue lightning from his outstretched hand to strike a snarling beast mid-lunge. The massive red-skinned humanoid figure recoiled violently as blue energy surged around its body and steam rose from its wounds. A monstrous creature with glowing eyes lunged forward through a misty alley, its muscular form radiating crimson energy. A glowing green energy beam struck the red monster in the head, causing its body to recoil violently in pain. A monstrous pink-hued creature fell through a digital realm, its body glowing with internal energy during a rapid descent. The muscular figure recoiled violently from an unseen impact, limbs flailing and blood spraying outward with explosive force. The masked fighter in white armor leaped through the air with a glowing blue blade, striking down toward a massive pink-skinned monster. The soldier in armored gear plunged a crackling blue energy blade into the chest of a snarling, red-eyed monster. A massive winged appendage erupted with blinding speed and electric energy, tearing through the air in a violent blur. A massive armored fist slammed into a snarling beast's face, sending blue lightning crackling across its skull. The hooded figure channeled a blinding golden light into the chest of a massive stone golem, causing it to shudder violently. A glowing yellow eye surrounded by crackling energy radiated intense power, with a sharp exclamation echoing through the air. Golden lightning cracked through the air with violent energy, illuminating streaks of red that suggested a powerful impact off-frame. The young man in bandages leaped midair, driving his lightning-wreathed fist into the skull of a monstrous creature below. A glowing blue system window declared tutorial completion, and a class change to Labyrinth Designer. A glowing blue system interface announced the acquisition of an exclusive skill called King of the Labyrinth. A glowing blue system window announced the tutorial had ended and asked if the user wished to return to a safe place. Heavy rain poured down on the empty city streets, washing over the silent buildings and deserted plaza. A uniformed officer watched in shock as 3 security guards struggled to restrain a violently thrashing man screaming refusal. The blonde boy with glasses gritted his teeth and shouted that he would not lose, rain streaming down his defiant face. A character took a bite from a chocolate-covered ice cream bar while uttering surprise as rain streaked the car window behind. The woman in tactical gear strode forward under an umbrella through pouring rain and declared that she had come to take them home. A group of armored men recoiled in shock and terror under heavy rain as one shouted identification and another stammered in dread. The man with glowing yellow eyes stood under an umbrella in the rain, holding food and smiling faintly while speaking about perfection. Numerous pedestrians walked along a wide paved promenade flanked by buildings and greenery, their movements casual and unhurried. A blue holographic interface declared the creation of a sphere as crackling energy coalesced into a swirling vortex below. A man sat by a fountain holding a glowing blue orb in his palm, while pedestrians walked along the tiered plaza behind him. A glowing blue holographic interface displayed the S-grade sphere's rules for labyrinth entry and warned that escaped foes grow stronger. A man perched on a fountain ledge and examined glowing blue holographic interfaces with a thoughtful expression while contemplating the data. The blue-haired man stared intently at a glowing blue holographic display detailing the tutorial labyrinth's rules and resolved to populate it. The young man rode atop a monstrous horned creature as he drove a glowing weapon into its skull amidst crackling lightning. The man with yellow eyes clenched his fist as a swirling blue energy vortex erupted from his knuckles against the urban street backdrop. The man with bandages sat before a woman, resting his chin on his hand while asking if she was okay. The girl in a school uniform held out a red apple with an eager expression, her eyes wide with hopeful anticipation. The man bit into an apple while accepting a bag from a woman and stated that he would enjoy them. The man with yellow eyes stared in shock at the bag of apples, while the girl beside him smiled brightly and pointed. The man walked forward holding an apple and a bag while speaking, as the girl behind him stumbled with a startled gasp. The young woman turned her head slightly, a bead of sweat tracing down her cheek as she offered a strained smile and asked confirmation. The young man with golden eyes took a bite of a red apple, his expression calm and focused as he chewed slowly. The man with bandaged cheeks stared forward while holding a half-eaten apple, as a woman behind him looked on with wide-eyed surprise. A terrified woman screamed in panic while being physically restrained by two uniformed officers, her eyes wide as she struggled against their grip. A towering boutique hotel rose beneath a crimson sky, its windows glowing warmly against the dusk. The man with a bandage on his cheek stood rigidly in profile while shouting that he did not feel well. A swirling pink and purple vortex of energy hovered above the school's running track, radiating an ominous glow against the twilight sky. The young woman in a school uniform reached out to touch the man's hand as he stood over her with a slight smile. The man with bandages on his face stood still in an outdoor plaza, his golden eyes narrowed as he demanded responsibility for the mess. Two security guards in neon vests flanked a dazed man between them, one speaking urgently into his radio while the other gripped his arm. The young man with a bandage on his cheek stood motionless in profile as a uniformed officer rushed toward him shouting for him to stop. Zio Yul thrust his Seoul Rescue Department ID card toward the camera with a sharp motion and declared his official status. A traffic officer raised his red baton to block the path of a man in a blue shirt, shouting that he could not proceed past that point. A police officer grabbed the purple-haired man's shoulder with a furious shout, startling him as his golden eyes widened in shock. A towering red-skinned warlord with glowing yellow eyes stood behind his assembled demonic warriors, arms crossed in radiating menace. The man with bandages on his face and arms stood rigidly as a uniformed officer sweated, while urgently demanding an explanation. Two officers restrained a limp woman between them as she slumped forward with eyes closed, while one shouted that she must be taken away immediately. The man in a light blue shirt stood defiantly before yellow and black tape, while declaring that he had to go in at the very least. The man with glowing yellow eyes stood in the foreground, while behind him a traffic officer holding a baton and megaphone looked shocked. The man in a light blue shirt and dark trousers walked toward the revolving doors of a building, his right fist clenched at his side. A wooden-framed glass door stood slightly ajar in a dimly lit room. The purple-haired man stood over a blood-splattered alley filled with fallen bodies, his fists clenched tight as he glared down in silent fury. A blue digital interface flashed to life, announcing that Sixth Sense was activated. The purple-haired man with golden eyes looked upward while declaring that someone was a bitch, his expression calm yet edged with disdain. A blurred projectile streaked across the room and slammed into a surface with a violent impact, sending shockwaves rippling through the air. The purple-haired man stood calm and unflinching as three red-skinned demons with glowing eyes lunged at him from all sides. The young man with a bandage on his cheek offered a faint, confident smile in a softly lit room while a quiet chuckle hung in the air. The blue-haired man stood with one hand on his hip and the other extended forward, summoning a swirling blue energy sphere above two bound enemies. A boy reached out as three others were sucked upward into a swirling blue vortex, debris flying around them while the room trembled. A horned, red-skinned figure with glowing yellow eyes lunged forward midair, mouth open in a roar as debris flew around him. A red-skinned warrior with glowing yellow eyes charged forward through a swirling blue portal, his body streaked with motion lines as he roared. The man in a purple shirt thrust his fist forward and unleashed a massive blue energy blast that tore through the office hallway. The blue-haired man gritted his teeth in shock as a glowing portal swirled to life before him, revealing three armed figures poised for battle. Two red-skinned horned demons lunged forward with claws extended and mouths open in battle cries, as a massive glowing yellow eye stared down from above. The man with bandages on his cheeks smiled as he conjured a swirling sphere of blue energy and lightning in his palm. Red-skinned demons sprinted forward with a blade, while a hulking purple monster lunged behind him with bared fangs. A massive purple humanoid charged down the checkered hallway with explosive force toward two figures bracing for impact. A purple monster lunged with extended claws as a red-armored figure stood ready with a rope-wrapped gauntlet. A red-skinned demon grinned menacingly amidst swirling purple energy while baring sharp teeth in cruel amusement. Two red-skinned beasts leaped through the air while a massive purple creature roared upward with jaws wide open. A man held a swirling blue orb projecting a green interface and smiled with quiet satisfaction at the magical light. A massive purple beast struck a green barrier as two hooded figures leaped down, one wielding a bone club. A red-skinned demon roared in fury as a high-speed blow sent its body recoiling violently against the teal wall. An unseen force threw a red-skinned warrior backward through the air, contorting his body into a silent scream. A blue-haired young man stared at a holographic display showing dungeon status, while a portal revealed two enemy markers. A man walked down a dim hallway holding a glowing orb and remarked that more corpses had been found near a bloodied dagger. A blue-haired figure stared at a holographic labyrinth interface and dared someone to pull more fast ones before declaring something inevitable awaited. A man with glowing eyes held three terrified demons in his palm and declared that they would be the ones getting hunted. A dark blue directory sign displayed Floor 17's prestige apartments and room numbers framed by floral accents. A dimly lit bedroom with a made bed and closed wardrobe stood silent and empty under cool blue light. A girl pressed both hands over her mouth and trembled violently while trying to stifle any sound as tears welled in her eyes. A young girl looked up in awe at a tall, bandaged man who leaned casually against a frame and spoke with a faint smirk. A character in gray sneakers stepped forward onto the red carpet, while sharp sound effects indicated sudden movement near a stationary black shoe. A tall man walked confidently down a hotel hallway beside a clapping girl and declared that they would proceed with calm assurance. A young man stood in profile before apartment door 1202 wearing a calm expression as he gazed forward with quiet resolve. A dark-haired man looked up at a blue grid filled with glowing figures and swirling portals with an expression of shock. Dark swirling particles coalesced into a humanoid silhouette between two vertical pillars under a purple twilight sky. A bandaged man stood still as a system window appeared before him, his golden eyes fixed forward in quiet focus. A digital warning alert declared that over half the labyrinth's guardian monsters had been annihilated, while glowing with urgent red static. Golden elevator doors remained closed as the floor indicator showed 17. A young girl stood frozen with wide eyes as a bandaged man pressed his hand against the elevator frame and spoke with tension. A man with bandages on his face raised his hand in greeting and smiled as he stood in a doorway. A man walked forward holding a glowing blue orb and touching his neck as footsteps echoed around him in the quiet hallway. The Red Goblin King stood surrounded by flaming goblins within a blue vortex and raised his arms as if commanding the inferno. A violet-haired man with a piercing yellow eye stared forward with cold intensity and an unyielding expression in a dim room. A bandaged man held up a glowing blue holographic screen, while his golden eyes fixed forward with cold intensity. A young man stumbled backward through a crackling blue vortex tearing open the floor as lightning arcs snapped around the swirling portal. A violet-haired man stood in a dim alley with sweat trickling down his temple as he stared forward with parted lips. A man stood over a fallen beast wreathed in blue lightning and declared that the fight was over with a grim expression. A purple-haired man raised his hands in a sharp gesture as blue energy surged upward and declared that the barrier was now active. A translucent green barrier shimmered into existence between stone structures and deflected a red crystal, while yellow shards hovered nearby. A red-skinned demon swung a flaming sword at a brick wall beside a man who raised his hand as digital fragments scattered. The young man extended his glowing blue hand forward with intense focus and declared that it was time to begin. A cloaked figure wreathed in flames lunged forward with a clawed hand extended and shouted that they would tear everything apart. A man in a white shirt swung a long staff with explosive force at a leaping demon, sending sparks flying and shattering the ground. A man with purple hair and golden eyes glared forward with a sharp expression, while glowing energy swirled around him in a charged atmosphere. A horned demon unleashed a fiery slash toward two fleeing men whose bodies recoiled as golden energy tore through the air. A man in a blue shirt swung a bat with intense force while his eye glowed yellow and crackled with lightning. A blue holographic window displayed Seo Yul's awakened class and stats, while he reflected that his level was now different. A red-skinned orc roared in fury as flames erupted from his clenched fist, and his glowing eyes burned with rage. A violet-haired man stood calmly amidst rising flames and declared that the fire would consume everything despite the inferno surrounding him. A man in a white shirt swung a glowing sword to sever a charging demon's tail, creating a massive burst of golden sparks. A red-skinned giant lunged forward in a blur of motion, with a blue energy-wreathed fist striking toward a cowering man below. Two massive red fists smashed together with explosive force, sending stone shards flying as a blinding white impact erupted between them. A man thrust his palm forward and unleashed a violent red explosion, slamming into a snarling demonic face, while shockwaves rippled through the air. A pink-haired figure lunged forward in a blur down a tiled hallway, striking another character who recoiled mid-step as speed lines radiated outward. A man with purple hair lunged forward with outstretched hands, his body surrounded by white energy streaks as he charged across cracked stone. A dark purple-haired man lunged forward with a bandage on his cheek and demanded to know where something was with fierce intensity. A red-skinned warrior snarled in rage while clutching his chest as black ash spread across his arm and steam rose from his body. A purple-haired man stood still in a brick alley with bruised knuckles while a sharp sound effect echoed beside him. A purple-haired man smiled faintly while wearing bandages on his cheeks and standing in a dim stone corridor with an open collar. A purple-haired man pointed forward at a kneeling warrior and declared that it would be better for the opponent to give up now. A red-skinned orc bared his fangs in a snarl while steam rose from his mouth and radiated fury as he glared forward. A bruised man stared in stunned disbelief with a hand hovering near his mouth and muttered that this could not be happening. A demonic figure roared in fury with flames erupting around his face and screamed that nothing would stop him now. A massive white blade sliced through a stone floor, sending cracks and flames erupting outward in its wake. A flaming demon charged forward roaring that he would kill his opponent, while the purple-haired man replied that the attacker must show his true form. A purple-haired man stood still in a dim corridor and said that something was wrong as the air grew heavy with tension. A red-skinned berserker lunged forward, wreathed in explosive fire and motion blur, as he crashed through the air with roaring fury. Heavy chains rattled violently against their stone floor mounts in the dark, echoing with a metallic clang that vibrated through the cold air. Sharp dark spikes surged upward in a blur of motion against a streaked purple and gray background. A massive armored monster roared as it slammed its flaming fist toward the ground while a man braced himself against the erupting heat. A purple-haired man stood in a dim brick hallway with a faint smile and spoke calmly about something unseen, while lanterns cast long shadows. A blue digital trap interface activated with a sharp mechanical sound and announced that the spike ceiling was now engaged. A purple-haired man stood calmly as a bloody headless body crashed down behind him and flames erupted while chains shattered against the walls. Massive chains hung from the ceiling in a misty, ruined stone chamber. A purple-haired man stood with hands on hips in a ruined room and surveyed the blood-splattered pillars with a calm expression. A dark-haired man stared at a holographic interface displaying an installation cost for a spike ceiling, while his finger hovered over the payment option. A blue-haired man stood before a brick building at night and smirked slightly as he declared that the game had only just begun. Two blue holographic notifications flashed with digital sound effects and announced a level up along with the incorporation of defeated goblins. A bandaged man clutched his neck in pain and muttered that he was exhausted as medics wheeled a stretcher through revolving doors behind him. A bandaged man raised a hand holding a small black object with a tense expression as motion lines streaked across the background. A purple-haired man stood in the foreground while an angry man in tactical gear shouted aggressively behind him as sound effects indicated sudden movement. A man in a dark uniform gripped another man's shoulders and demanded to know what caused the injuries on his face. A large armored man gripped a smaller figure by the shoulders and demanded honest answers while a guard offered to remember something for beef. A firefighter gripped the shoulder of a bandaged man while an older figure with glasses faced them with a tense expression. A man with glasses placed his hand over his heart in a formal gesture and smiled, faintly bathed in the cool blue city glow. A brown-haired man stared with narrowed eyes at the purple-haired youth and demanded to know what was going on as his expression hardened. A purple-haired man stood in the background looking confused and muttered that this was ridiculous, while a large armored figure turned away abruptly. A gray-haired man lunged forward with arms outstretched toward an armored figure, while a tall man stood rigidly between them with an unyielding expression. A purple-haired man glared silently while a larger man recoiled slightly and demanded to know what he was doing as tension crackled between them. A man with glasses stared intensely with a glowing red eye visible through his lens and spoke words implying a threat or revelation. A man with glasses raised his hand toward another figure and smiled faintly, as if offering reassurance despite the looming armored presence. A man with glowing yellow eyes and bandages stared forward in silence with a cold and unyielding expression beneath the dim blue light. A muscular, bald man radiated golden flames with arms crossed and declared his dominance as a shadowed figure cowered in terror behind him. An orange-haired man grinned while crossing his armored arms in the foreground, as a dark-haired man watched him from the background with a weary expression. A fist clenched with visible tension and strained to convey intense emotion or resolve against a dark blue background. A hand gripped the collar of a man in glasses who stared wide-eyed in shock as rain streaked down his face. A young man with dark hair smiled gently with closed eyes, as if savoring a quiet moment under the cool blue night glow. A man smirked with narrowed eyes and a sharp grin while exuding cold confidence under dim purple light. A man in a blue shirt repeatedly slapped another man's head and arm with a wide grin, while the victim shouted that he should wait. A man with glasses grimaced in pain as a bandaged hand grabbed his suit collar and he bluntly stated something while sweating. A man with glowing eyes gripped an older figure's shoulder and demanded sponsorship for their many needs with a calm yet intense expression. A man with glasses stared in wide-eyed shock and whispered that 10 billion could not be real, while jagged white energy crackled around him. A jogger passed a gazebo where 4 elders conversed beneath the trees. A bandaged man sipped iced coffee in the sunlit park. A man laughed on a bench, his drink glowing with sparkling light. 2 men loomed behind a panicked caller, one flexing while the other smirked. 4 uniformed men stared in disbelief, questioning if Senior Seoyul faced goblins alone. Floating portraits displayed details about hidden classes and guild outreach without action. Golden-eyed energy swirled around a bandaged hand as a holographic interface appeared. Gold coins fell around a blue repair interface detailing labyrinth costs. A blue-haired man hesitated over a prompt asking for 53 gold to fix the tutorial. A hand pressed ancient runes on a glowing interface, triggering pulsing symbols. A young man held a swirling blue portal while sipping from a cup. A bandaged youth stared tensely at his phone beneath dappled sunlight. A smiling man held up a small screen and announced the recording was complete. A lavender-haired woman narrowed her eye and declared the order applied to the listener. A blonde woman smiled confidently while speaking on her phone in a bright office. A silver-haired man demanded demanded to know who spoke on the other end of the line. A silver-haired character gasped in shock at an incoming call from Seoul. A hand hovered over a tipped cup, sliding it across the surface with a scrape. A bandaged man stood in the park as a low hum vibrated around him. A young man winced outdoors, squeezing his eyes shut while emitting a pained groan. A furious man screamed into his phone, demanding who dared defy him. A pale-haired woman gripped her phone and fist, shouting to know who called. A young man exhaled visible breath while gripping his smartphone before a school fence. A man spoke into his phone on a park path with his back turned. A smirking man held a phone to his ear as crackling energy arced around his head. Sunlight filtered through green trees above a tiled roof structure. A hand slammed a mahjong tile onto the board, cracking it under pressure. An elderly man slammed his fist on a go board and shouted for another game. A stern young man with yellow eyes stood motionless in a sunlit garden. A figure viewed from behind radiated intense red energy that illuminated the darkness. A bandaged man pressed a finger to his lips in silent contemplation. An elder glared at a youth behind him, thinking the boy looked like an outdoorsman. An old man recoiled in shock, clutching his stinging cheek as a youth demanded an answer. A young man pointed downward and demanded something from the stunned older man. A glowing blue system window activated with a chime to announce sixth sense activation. A streak of light slashed across a rigid blue-haired man's focused face. A shocked man stared upward as a massive energy explosion erupted behind him. An elder sprayed powder on a tree, causing cracks while two others recoiled from the crumbling ground. A pink-haired man grabbed a wrist with flaring red aura and ordered the captive not to run. A purple-haired man listened in tense silence on his phone, sweat rolling down his cheek. 5 masked hunters with glowing eyes stood solemnly before a blood-red sky. A lone hunter stood atop a mountain of impaled foes under a crimson sky. An elder extended his hand amid red aura and condemned the move as useless trash. An angry elder narrowed his glowing red eyes and demanded who dared disrespect him. A white-haired man bent forward clutching his stomach while an older man looked up in shock. A suspicious elder narrowed his red eyes and demanded to know who approached him. A purple-haired man held up a ringing phone from Inspector Lee Jianghee with amused sharpness. A snarling elder lunged forward and grabbed a youth's collar, sending him stumbling back in alarm. A suspicious elder narrowed his red eyes and demanded who dared disturb him. A blonde woman stood over 2 seated men and declared rejection with cold authority. A silver-haired man stared forward while an elder glanced sideways and another stood behind them. A silver-haired woman turned her head slightly and spoke with a faint, calm smile. A bandaged man pointed forward with a slight yet commanding smile in the park. A bruised man lay on the ground and shouted that they were all bastards. An elder raised his hand in a dismissive gesture while speaking to someone off-panel. A towering glass skyscraper rose sharply against a bright blue sky. An elder braced himself against a monstrous shadow while glowing with intense blue energy. A muscular figure hunched forward in pouring rain, bracing against an unseen force. A gauntleted hand gripped a gleaming metallic object tightly amidst sudden impact. An elder held aloft a sword wreathed in blue energy and demanded recognition of his power. An elder thrust a glowing blue sword forward and declared the end in a stone chamber. A robed man sat hunched over 3 small figures, dwarfed by his looming silhouette. A bandaged man stood before rows of seated martial artists with hands clasped behind his back. A brown-haired artist yelled furiously while gripping the shoulder of a flinching dark-haired man. A pale-haired character stared flatly while students behind pointed and laughed at the obvious truth. A light-haired young man shouted furiously with narrowed eyes amid watching martial artists. A gloved hand gripped the ornate golden hilt of a sword steadily. A white-haired master gripped his sword fiercely and demanded the opponent face him now. A martial artist lunged with a glowing fist aimed at a head while shouting this ended now. An elderly man with white hair and red eyes stared forward with an intense, menacing expression. A dark-haired man stood motionless before a blurred metallic object thrust toward him. A focused young man demanded to know who dared challenge him amidst thick tension. A bruised man recoiled in shock as someone declared on Siwoo's answer more accurate. An elderly master bowed deeply in submission before a young man who spoke from off-panel. A purple-haired youth turned his head slightly to speak seriously before rows of motionless figures. A cloaked figure gripped a sword hilt while a sweating man recoiled in fear behind. An elder pointed his finger forward and demanded something with narrowed red eyes. A tense man sweated while another behind him clenched a fist and shouted he would not let it go. A character bared cracked teeth in a snarl and demanded the opponent die right then. A blonde man grabbed a purple-haired shoulder and shouted in fury while sweat beaded on his temple. A sharp-eyed youth stared forward with cold intensity, thinking the person was no child. 3 men stood together in a warm room with serious expressions as someone mentioned an impending challenge. A white-haired man raised an index finger with a knowing smirk and gleaming red eyes. A bandaged man stared in shock while sweating as another shouted angrily with a clenched fist. A dark-haired man spoke urgently behind a white-robed figure, holding a sword in silent defiance. An elderly martial artist dominated the foreground and declared the young man behind him his disciple. A violet-haired man stared intently forward with his mouth parted as if caught mid bated breath. A white-haired warrior stood with multiple swords strapped to his back under a blood-red sky. An elder turned his head slightly and extended one finger forward with narrowed red eyes. A dark purple-haired man stood facing a wooden wall, motionless in the dim light. A hand gripped another's wrist tightly, fingers pressing into the skin with visible tension. A smirking young man declared it more than enough against a pulsing violet backdrop. An ornate hall stretched toward distant glowing red portals. The white-haired elder clenched his fist and demanded answers for their intrusion, while crimson energy crackled behind him. The blue-haired man gripped the gray-haired man's shoulder as both stared forward with intense focus under cold light. The purple-haired man stood in silence with a cold, unreadable expression despite the bandage on his cheek. A jagged wall of orange lightning and dark smoke erupted violently across the room to obscure the ceiling. The dark-haired man stood motionless while the brown-haired martial artist lunged forward screaming that he would crush him. The blonde girl stood with crossed arms as three uniformed men screamed and lunged around her amidst drifting snowflakes. The purple-haired man gripped a black strap across his chest while debris floated in the air around him. A foot clad in black fabric stepped firmly onto wooden planks and produced a sharp thud. The white-haired figure lunged forward with a raised fist and shouted while two onlookers watched from below. The old man opened his mouth wide in sudden anger and demanded that someone leave the premises immediately. A central figure erupted in violent red energy and screamed in agony, while two onlookers recoiled from the explosive aura. A glowing blue system interface flashed with urgent text announcing the presence of a weapon master's aura. The man with glowing yellow eyes gritted his teeth in rage and screamed that he would destroy everything. The red-haired character snarled with bared teeth as golden lightning crackled around their glowing yellow eye. The blue-haired man watched a glowing spear pierce the lake's surface while petals drifted silently around him. A glowing blue spear floated vertically in the night sky and radiated light among drifting petals. A glowing blue system window announced the acquisition of serenity and mastery of Dragon King's spearmanship. The white-haired elder snarled with bared teeth and demanded to know who dared challenge his authority. The dark-haired man braced for impact while the brown-haired attacker lunged forward screaming as blood splattered between them. The brown-haired disciple screamed for a medic while clutching his bleeding shoulder as comrades cried out in terror. The elderly man stroked his beard thoughtfully and smiled slightly, while musing that everything proceeded according to plan. The elderly man stood in the foreground, while two younger men watched him intently from behind. A gloved hand drove a blade upward into an opponent's throat, while blood spurted from the wound. A robed figure raised a jagged blade to meet a surging wall of crimson lightning and crackling energy. The young man with spiky gray hair lunged forward while gripping a large sword that cut diagonally across the frame. The dark-haired man yawned widely while holding a scythe and covering his mouth with his other hand. The young man knelt on the floor as red energy surged from his leg against the overwhelming power. The young man lunged forward with a furious expression and declared that he must prove it with strength. The man in white robes lunged forward with explosive force and shattered a fiery barrier into glowing fragments. The man in a suit stood with arms crossed and demanded to know why someone was there. The elderly master smirked approvingly and remarked that the performance was not bad. A cloaked figure collapsed to the stone floor with a heavy thud while a man watched with a curved blade. The spiky-haired man grabbed the bandaged man's collar and glared while demanding what he was doing. The young man with violet hair turned his head slightly and smiled faintly in the soft daylight. The elderly man raised his index finger while speaking with a stern and commanding expression. The man gripped a curved blade and stood motionless before a crackling red energy wall. The man with purple hair braced himself in a defensive stance and raised his hand to intercept the attack. The white-haired man pointed his finger forward and declared that the time had come. The young man with dark purple hair stood in profile with bowed head and closed eyes as he sighed heavily. A swirling vortex of blue energy pulsed with inner light and radiated outward in concentric ripples. The blue-haired warrior drove his glowing arm into the stone wall to block a monster's bite. A cloaked man leaned over a wide-eyed girl in the rain while she stared up in silent awe. A woman collapsed in tears while clutching her head as another girl screamed in distress behind her. The dark-haired man channeled blue energy into his right hand to clash against a fiery red attack. A figure with glowing red eyes and bared teeth lunged forward in a blur of motion with crackling energy. The young man lunged forward and unleashed a massive wave of red energy while the technique name flashed above. The dark-haired man screamed with his mouth wide open, while others shouted in terror amidst floating debris. The elderly man stared forward with narrowed red eyes and an unyielding expression that radiated quiet authority. The young man stared wide-eyed and sweating in shock with his mouth agape as if gasping. A muscular man watched with wide eyes as another man was violently slammed into the stone floor. The man with purple hair rested a crackling axe on his shoulder and asked if anyone minded his junior stealing their spot. The young man gripped his spear tightly and stared forward with grim resolve while the elder watched in silence. The elderly man raised his index finger and smiled faintly as if delivering a quiet warning. The man with purple hair smiled confidently despite a bandage on his cheek, as the air crackled with tension. The man with purple hair stood alone gripping a cane, while shadowed figures raised clenched fists around him. Sunlight bathed a cluttered alleyway lined with exposed pipes and a weathered wooden door. The man in a dark blazer grabbed the girl's hair and yanked her head back while telling her she should have come out. A blonde figure knelt behind a pinned woman and gripped her hair while she gasped in pain. The blonde woman held a cigarette and stared in shock while gripping another woman's hair as smoke curled between them. The woman shoved the man backward and caused him to reel while he demanded what she thought she was doing. The man grimaced with bared teeth and narrowed eyes in a classroom. The woman in a school uniform glared forward with narrowed eyes and radiated cold fury. The man bowed his head and gritted his teeth in frustration while demanding to know why things were turning out this way. A shadowy figure lay motionless on a hospital bed behind a translucent grid-patterned curtain. A character's eye narrowed sharply in intense focus as vertical motion lines streaked across the frame. The man in a suit leaned forward with a mocking grin and demanded to know if the listener thought they were special. The man recoiled backward in shock as a woman collapsed forward onto the floor while he demanded to know what was happening. A man in a dark coat stood with his back turned overlooking a kneeling figure who collapsed onto the dusty floor. The man with long white hair stood in a dim alley with hands in pockets and a calm expression. The man in a blue blazer stood with his mouth open while a blonde woman gestured toward a person on the floor. The white-haired man stood behind the suited man who spoke urgently about an approaching threat. The man in a suit smirked confidently and said that they should have known better than to cross him. A massive purple energy dome crackled with lightning above the city, while an unseen voice declared they could play freely. A tall glass skyscraper stood beside a shorter building as the sun set behind them. Two figures stood facing each other on a tiled floor with boots planted firmly. The man with yellow eyes smiled while holding a black baton as the blonde woman stared ahead in shock. The man gripped a towering golden spear that radiated light and hummed with energy. The man walked forward while his hand dissolved into digital particles as the woman asked if the surveillance department was involved. The dark-haired man extended his arm to shove back a screaming blonde woman who lunged at him, shouting why him. The man in a gray hoodie grabbed the cap-wearing figure's arm and demanded to know who he was. The woman stared up in wide-eyed terror at the looming man and gasped that she did not mean to. The man with purple hair stood rigidly in a server room and demanded to know what was happening. The woman lunged forward with a clenched fist and shouted that she would kill him while the man recoiled slightly. A hand gripped and twisted fabric with sharp force to cause it to crumple violently. The woman grabbed the tall man's shirt and pulled him close while he looked down at her. The man smirked with a phone pressed to his ear and listened intently. The man with bandages on his face stared forward menacingly and demanded to know exactly who dragged him away. A small pink figure lay motionless among glowing underbrush deep within a mist-shrouded forest. 5 figures stood motionless in the dim clearing, their expressions tense as they awaited an unseen threat. The suited man smiled confidently and declared that everything proceeded according to plan beside the glaring woman. He draped an arm around her shoulders to steady her and asked if she remained all right. The strained character clenched their teeth tight while visible tension radiated from their suppressed expression. The gray-haired girl lunged forward in a frenzy and screamed that she would tear them apart. The dark-haired man grinned broadly while the silver-haired man remarked that this was exactly how things should be. The long-haired suited man lunged forward with a clenched fist and an open-mouthed shout. A blue sneaker stomped down onto a black boot with force, kicking up dust and debris. The white-haired figure slammed the dark-haired man violently into the ground, sending dirt flying outward. The silver-haired man pinned the screaming woman to the ground and declared that she would not escape. A massive scythe blade descended toward the kneeling figure as 2 bystanders stood frozen in terror. The silver-haired man gripped a glowing blue device emitting digital fragments while the blonde woman watched in shock. The dark-suited man lunged forward with a snarl as an explosive burst of green energy flung 3 victims backward. The suited man screamed in terror while standing over the dead blonde woman bleeding into her gray cloak. The dark-haired man grimaced in shock and demanded to know what the hell was going on. The silver-haired figure stared intensely forward, their expression hardened by resolve against a looming unseen threat. 4 insected warriors surged forward with jagged limbs extended as a deep rumbling sound vibrated the air. The blue-haired man held a phone to his ear and delivered calm instructions with a faint smile. The camouflaged soldier stood over defeated insectoids holding a spear and reported that the area was clear. A hand crushed a red cigarette pack while an unseen character declared that smoking was bad for health. The suited man held an unlit cigarette near his mouth and gazed downward with a weary expression. The purple-haired soldier gripped a weapon while holding a phone and demanded to know who was there. The tactical soldier stood motionless and gazed into a glowing green cavern shrouded in mist. The soldier stood at attention before a massive armored door glowing with an orange warning symbol. The dark-haired youth thrust a glowing purple spear upward to impale a green monster lunging at him. A boot stomped down on the red-eyed insectoid's head and crushed it into the damp ground. A man in tactical gear sprinted forward through a misty forest with focused determination. A jagged metallic shard tore through the air with violent force and trailed green energy streaks. A soldier in tactical gear leaped backward as a jagged purple energy surge erupted from the ground beside him. A blue-haired figure stood frozen in a misty cavern as an armored insectoid swarm descended from above. A glowing blue system interface displayed a message stating it was generating a spear. A gloved hand held a swirling blue energy vortex that crackled with electricity and pulsed outward. The blue-haired man stood in a misty forest and demanded that every friend be called immediately. A massive armored figure loomed in the foreground, while a red-eyed winged insectoid hovered nearby. The colossal red-eyed beast lunged downward at the suspended warrior, with claws extended for assault. The purple-haired youth stared forward intensely and declared that they would not retreat. The armored insectoid swarm dove through the air with blinding speed to close in on an unseen target. The blue-haired tactical soldier sprinted forward as three monstrous insectoids dove toward him from above. The blue-haired warrior slashed through a swarm of insectoid monsters with a crackling energy blade. The blue-haired soldier gritted his teeth in fierce determination and charged forward through streaking motion lines. A holographic status display reported current allied and remaining enemy unit counts against a streaked background. The red-skinned warrior lunged forward and drove his blade into the glowing skull of a monstrous insectoid. The hooded figure dashed through a streaking green void while wielding a glowing blue blade. A beam of light slashed through the air and struck a swirling vortex with a sharp impact. A soldier thrust both hands forward to unleash a roaring blue vortex of lightning at the descending swarm. The hooded figure channeled crackling blue energy into his palm and declared that the hunt began now. The dark-armored warrior was violently hurled backward through the air by a massive surge of blue energy. The hooded tactical soldier raised both arms triumphantly above a swirling blue vortex and declared the gate open. The winged masked warrior hovered in the air and launched a massive blue energy sphere downward. A swirling vortex of green and blue energy exploded outward with intense light and motion. The giant armored insect drove its stinger into the fallen red demon's chest and injected glowing blue energy. Two armored insectoids lunged forward aggressively, while dark energy swirled around them in a chaotic aura. Multiple armored figures burst violently through churning water with sharp blades raised high. A violent green surge of water erupted upward with explosive force and crashed against a dark stone wall. Several masked insectoids drifted motionless through swirling green water with limbs splayed and eyes vacant. The hooded tactical man stared at a swirling blue portal hovering above his palm and murmured it was his gold. The hooded figure clenched his fist as blue energy crackled around it and declared this the power of a hunter. A soldier stood alone in a cavern beneath glowing green auroras with still and silent posture. The figure strode forward in blue trousers and white sneakers while steps echoed with sharp sounds. The red-hooded man sprinted forward and shouted that they must keep running or the monsters would chase them. The dark-haired man screamed that someone was running away while the white-haired figure moved behind him. A man with dark hair gritted his teeth in furious desperation and shouted that he would not let this happen. A blurred metallic surface streaked diagonally across the frame with violent motion lines conveying sudden impact. The red-hooded man dove forward as two fighters clashed weapons amid explosive sparks, and another screamed in terror. A man in a dark suit recoiled with his hand outstretched, while a woman behind him flinched in terror. The insected creature lunged forward with its blade-like limb slashing through the air. A white-haired man stood grimly with glowing golden energy erupting beside him, while the dark-haired man screamed in terror. The suited couple stumbled backward through a greenlit tunnel as a massive shadowy entity lunged toward them. A man in a suit screamed in agony as unseen hands grabbed him while he clutched the woman's head. The golden armored warrior lunged forward and slashed through the air with a crimson energy blade. A man and woman recoiled in terror as a grotesque red-eyed creature lunged toward them. A man screamed with his mouth wide open while a woman beside him stared upward in shock. A gloved hand gripped a staff crackling with red lightning and white sparks illuminating the misty ground. The bandaged hooded soldier stood beneath moonlit trees and asked if it was them. The suited woman screamed in terror, demanding answers as swirling green energy engulfed her. A smug soldier held the clinging woman close while quiet green energy pulsed around them. A dark-haired man watched with alarm as a hooded soldier guarded a girl in the glowing cavern. A furious man in a suit jabbed his finger forward, refusing to accept such an outcome. The weary woman stood beside the tactical gear-clad man while eerie green light filled the forest. The gray-haired girl stared upward in stunned silence as an unseen force seemed to strike her. A hooded soldier pointed a weapon at the gray-haired person while heavy tension filled the dim forest. One soldier pinned a man down while another recoiled in horror, shouting that this was madness. A warrior slammed a jagged black sword into the ground, cracking the earth and exploding debris outward. The hooded soldier clasped his hands with a smirk, declaring he would do something Yonhee must not see. A man in a dark suit clenched his fists and shouted furiously, demanding something with intense rage. A camouflaged soldier stood firm while a suited man recoiled in shock, demanding to know what happened. A gray-haired man smoked on a crate, while three figures stood behind two motionless bodies in the alley. The suited man looked up strainedly, demanding information about a criminal who bought immunity with money. A dark sneaker delivered a forceful kick that exploded outward, sending shockwaves radiating through the air. A young man's face contorted in shock and pain as blue energy slashed across the background behind him. A camouflaged soldier threw a terrified man to the ground, while the victim screamed he was no enemy agent. The hooded figure raised a clenched fist with glowing yellow eyes, shouting a command as green energy radiated from his knuckles. A hooded soldier grabbed a suited man by the collar and yanked him forward amidst swirling teal energy. A white-haired figure swung a glowing golden blade downward to cleave an armored opponent while a man braced below. The hooded figure narrowed their glowing yellow eyes and parted their lips, issuing a silent warning against the teal backdrop. A man with long white hair and a scarred cheek stared forward with a cold, unreadable expression. A dark-haired man screamed in anguish, sweating profusely as he shouted that such a thing was impossible. The white-haired assassin lunged forward with a glowing blade aimed at the throat, demanding the old man's life. A gloved hand gripped a dark pole tightly as motion lines conveyed sudden force against a blurred background. A camouflaged soldier swung a baton downward at the silver-haired man's head, creating sparks and radiating green energy. A gloved hand gripped a black staff mid-swing, generating sharp motion lines and impact sparks with violent force. A hooded man with glowing yellow eyes whirled a massive weapon behind him, shouting a challenge as red energy flared. The camouflaged soldier lunged forward with a glowing red spear aimed at the white-haired man's back, creating a violent energy burst. The silver-haired man narrowed his blue eyes and gritted his teeth, demanding to know who dared challenge his authority. A camouflaged soldier gripped a crackling red energy blade with both hands, yellow lightning arcing across his glowing eyes. The white-haired man gritted his teeth in strain as golden energy erupted beside him, distorting the air around his face. A camouflaged soldier lunged forward with a glowing red blade clashing against the white-haired man's golden energy burst. A white-haired figure descended with a glowing blade toward a hooded soldier whose arm crackled with red lightning. A gloved hand crushed something with violent force, sending sparks and debris flying outward in a burst of raw power. The hooded figure drove a crackling red energy fist forward, shouting he had no choice but to throw a punch. A gloved fist smashed into the silver-haired character's face, snapping his head back as blood sprayed from his nose. A cloaked figure lunged forward with a bloodied blade and struck the white-haired opponent across the chest, sending him reeling. A suited man screamed for the injured figure to get up while the wounded man asked if he bought his B rank status. The hooded figure gripped their shoulder tightly, breath visible in the cold air as they demanded to know who was there. A massive blue energy slash tore through the air and sent multiple hornet monsters flying, marking the hunter's surpassing of B rank. A masked figure stood motionless with a faint smirk as the sound of a slicing blade echoed beside them. A man gripped a dark rock tightly in his right hand, declaring that this was merely a bureau. An enraged man in a dark suit lunged forward, screaming that someone was laughing at him while a hooded figure watched calmly. The hooded figure swung the staff downward and struck the man in blue across the chest, sending him crashing to the ground. A massive dark projectile slammed into the ground and sent a violent shockwave rippling through the air as blood sprayed upward. A camouflaged soldier strode forward with a glowing blue blade trailing behind him, while an opponent flew backward midair. A bloodied man screamed in agony with his mouth wide open and hands raised near his face in terror. A character with dark blue hair and a sharp yellow eye stared intensely forward, brow furrowed in suspicion or focus. A man in a suit sat on the ground clutching his bleeding face, demanding to know who sent the camouflaged soldier. A camouflaged soldier held the head of a limp, injured woman with gray hair as she slumped against his armored leg. A camouflaged soldier cradled an unconscious woman's legs while facing a terrified man sinking in glowing water who screamed he meant no kill. A man in a dark suit crouched low with one arm thrust forward and teeth bared, bracing against an incoming force. 3 snarling wolves with glowing purple eyes surged forward through the rain, fangs bared and claws extended with crackling energy. A man in a suit fell backward into shallow water with pure terror, screaming they were coming as 4 massive wolves closed in. A blood-splattered man screamed in agony as he recoiled from a violent impact, eyes wide and mouth agape in silent pain. A camouflaged soldier carried an unconscious woman through a misty forest as 3 snarling beasts emerged from the shadows behind them. A massive metallic door with a glowing triangular emblem stood sealed under harsh overhead light. 2 women embraced and wept in the foreground while a suited man gestured dismissively, and a hooded soldier stood silently nearby. A brown-haired man smiled slightly while speaking as a hooded figure behind him held a phone to their ear with cold intensity. News headlines reported the spread of the Yellow Belt kidnapping case, revealing a perpetrator's connection to a Supreme Court justice. A woman in a business suit stood behind a gray-haired man, speaking urgently while holding up a phone to create tension. A sleek modern skyscraper with angular glass panels rose above city streets bathed in soft daylight. A man with gray hair and yellow eyes stared intently at a glowing blue holographic interface as data streamed silently across the screen. A glowing blue holographic quest interface displayed an extermination mission to defeat the Queen Hornet within 30 days alongside severe penalties. A camouflaged soldier stood before a swirling vortex of emerald energy, witnessing the colossal form of a monstrous entity emerging. A masked figure with glowing orange eyes and white hair stood surrounded by swirling purple energy, exuding an aura of menacing power. A figure with glowing red eyes and clawed hands lunged forward, driving twin blades into a swirling vortex of green energy. A young man with dark blue hair and piercing yellow eyes turned his head slightly, demanding to know who dared interrupt him. An office chair vibrated violently on the carpeted floor, rattling as if struck by a sudden impact. A young man with sharp yellow eyes raised his gloved hand in a stopping gesture, calmly stating that something came first. A man in a dark hoodie with neon green accents held a thick stack of papers while speaking calmly with slight amusement. A young man with sharp yellow eyes stood still in a hooded jacket, his expression unreadable as he faced forward under cool light. A brown-haired man in a dark hoodie sat at his desk and stared toward double doors as impact shattered the glass pane. A boot pressed down onto the ground with a sharp thud, kicking up dust as it landed firmly on the dirt path. A man with a backpack stood at the base of wide stone steps, looking up toward a traditional gate where a figure waited. A young man with purple hair and piercing yellow eyes stared forward with a calm, focused expression against a soft green backdrop. The elderly man with white hair and red eyes raised his hand to his chest while inviting someone inside with a stern expression. A silent pagoda stood beneath a pink dusk sky. Jin asked if the figure was truly who they claimed while sweat traced his cheek. Disciple Huang and Elder Beak bowed in unison with quiet intensity. Jin declared that the sect's honor depended on their next move. Jin placed a hand on the bowing elder and stated he would handle everything. Jin bowed deeply until the heavy thud echoed through the hall. Master Guan stood silently while a disciple gasped and asked if he was her master. A white-horned dragon statue rested on red cloth before lattice windows. Elder Beak spoke of the trophy's significance while standing before it with exposed scars. A hand gripped a chair arm with visible tension against an ornate backdrop. A violent burst of red energy erupted outward with jagged, explosive force. Elder Beak lunged forward as crimson energy erupted behind him in silent fury. Bare-chested and flaring with red aura, Elder Beak demanded who dared challenge his authority. Elder Beak slammed a bandaged fist into stone, shattering the surface with exploding red impact. Disciple Huang stared in shock while Master Guan clapped and a girl cheered that Grandpa was best. Elder Beak clutched his chest, staggered back, and demanded to know what poison was used. Jin gripped wheelchair armrests with a clenched jaw as if bracing for impact or suppressing rage. Jin twisted his head to glare backward with bared teeth and radiating dark lines. Elder Beak stroked his beard and declared that the boy had finally awakened. Jin gripped two curved handles and screamed that he would not yield. Master Guan raised a palm, closed his eyes, and sighed that the disciple should leave. Elder Beak declared something with unmistakable authority, while narrowing red eyes in a wooden hall. Jin gritted his teeth in terror and trembled as the departing elders walked away. Master Guan stood motionless with a stern expression while processing an unseen thought. Ryan sprinted up long stone stairs toward a traditional gate under the open sky. Ryan looked up with a serious expression, as if reacting to something unseen above. Ryan stared forward sternly, while Jin screamed in rage behind him from a wheelchair. Ryan stood over an ornate floor panel with a clenched fist and grim determination. Ryan stood still with subtle tension as faint motion lines suggested a sudden shift in attention. Ryan loomed with turned back over a staff-wielding boy who looked up with wide eyes. Ryan faced Minyu, who held a short staff, smiled, and said something casual on the porch. Minyu laughed with closed eyes while placing a hand on Ryan's shoulder as Ryan turned away annoyed. Minyu held a broom and looked up at Ryan, who stared down blankly in soft light. Ryan stomped forward with clenched fists and demanded something aggressively, while Minyu stood calmly behind. Ryan stood with bowed head in silence as a large white cloak obscured the other figure. Minyu held a scythe before Ryan, who looked up surprised as they conversed on the veranda. Jin gripped a sword over his shoulder, smiled confidently, and declared he would handle everything himself. Ryan turned his head slightly, narrowed his eyes in annoyance, and stated the situation was irritating. Jin gripped wheelchair arms and screamed that he would crush them all while sweat flew from his brow. Jin clutched his bleeding mouth in shock while guards stood behind him holding staffs. Ryan lunged forward to grab Jin's collar as Jin grinned wildly, and Minyu shouted nearby. Ryan observed from the foreground as Jin gripped a massive stone lion statue with straining muscles. Ryan stood in a traditional hall with a sharp gaze assessing the situation before him. Jin grinned fiercely with dripping sweat and radiated manic excitement while leaning forward in fur-lined garments. A massive clawed foot stomped down with crushing force and shattered the ground beneath it. Jin stood sweating and stated urgently that he needed to leave immediately, while sect members reacted with shock. Jin stood strained in a grand hall as Ryan pressed a water bottle against his shoulder. Minyu held a blue water jug with mouth slightly open as if speaking under dim lantern light. Jin leaned forward with dripping sweat and stared intently at something just out of frame. Jin stared in shock while sweating profusely and holding a blue water bottle as Ryan watched intently. Jin and Minyu stood side by side on tiled floor as an off-screen voice began to speak. Snow-covered trees framed a traditional building, glowing with warm light under a cold night sky. Minyu stood with closed eyes and remarked there were so many people while Jin wiped his face. Sunlight filtered through a dense green canopy above a winding forest path. The tactical squad stood rigidly before a swirling purple vortex crackling with unstable energy. The scouts stood side by side with solemn expressions and gazes fixed forward, awaiting orders. The Steelblood orc remained trapped inside a glowing blue energy cage crackling with electric arcs. The patrol unit walked through a glowing blue portal while one yawned and remarked it was usually different. A rookie soldier stared upward with wide eyes as a towering blue energy figure loomed behind him. A hooded stranger faced enforcers in a misty space, while a soldier demanded to know where the money was. Blood-splattered jaw clenched tightly in pain as crimson droplets fell into cold blue light. An enforcer recoiled and demanded the filthy object be thrown away as a ghost materialized behind him. A monstrous mouth stretched wide in a blood-smeared grin and snarled with feral intensity. Mercenaries laughed in the foreground, while the behemoth loomed behind them, crackling with blue energy. The containment team braced against the violent pull of a swirling energy vortex erupting in the street. Captain Vance glared down at the hooded stranger with crossed arms while silently assessing the challenger. The hooded stranger stood in the foreground while Captain Vance crossed arms and demanded to know what was happening. The hooded stranger turned their head sharply with mouth open, as if calling out or reacting urgently. Captain Vance gazed upward at a towering skyscraper while the hooded stranger looked on in shock. The hooded stranger stood motionless in a dim corridor, observing something off-frame with a pulsing red shoulder glow. A red indicator light glowed on the shoulder of a dark armored suit, casting a faint crimson reflection. The Korea Martial Arts Association building stood atop shattered stone cliffs under a pale sky. A massive stone hand lay shattered on the ground as fleeing disciples ran from the collapsing structure. A crying girl turned back in panic while her mother shouted for her to keep moving and not look back. The behemoth loomed over Elder Beak in tattered robes and radiated oppressive dread with bleeding crimson energy. Elder Beak gritted his teeth in pain and demanded to know who dared strike him. A smiling soldier stood with closed eyes while a comrade rested a hand on his head and another grinned broadly under the sun. Armored soldiers recoiled in shock as a jagged black mass erupted from the ground between them, while one shouted that something emerged beneath their feet. Two soldiers froze as glowing-eyed stone beasts loomed over a small figure trapped beneath rubble near a pulsing red crystal. A gloved hand reached forward while two armored figures fled frantically across the barren wasteland against crumbling cliffs. A bloodied man lay pinned beneath rubble with wide, horrified eyes as crimson streaks marked his face under the crushing weight. A hand gripped the red-wrapped handle of a large, blocky hammer with a worn metallic head above a wooden floor. A masked figure in dark armor pinned a man against a shattered wall with a gloved fist to his throat, while recalling being saved silently and wanting more. A shadowy, red-eyed figure loomed over a fallen person in tattered white robes as its jagged form radiated menace and crimson light bled into the air. A bloodied man with a torn robe thrust his fist forward in a violent punch while screaming furiously for satisfaction as the air vibrated with raw aggression. Three martial artists recoiled in shock and pain as an opponent launched their comrade through the air with a strike that radiated cold dominance over the stunned crowd. A man in a white uniform lunged forward with glowing yellow energy around his fist to strike a massive red rock formation that shattered under the impact. A fighter in a tattered white uniform recoiled as a massive red energy entity erupted behind him with glowing eyes and swirling power that filled the gymnasium with violent force. A monstrous figure wreathed in red energy lunged forward with a snarling grin and glowing eyes, while a short-haired man stood before him to face the attack head-on. A wounded martial artist in white robes thrust his glowing golden arm forward to strike a red-cloaked opponent and send a shockwave through the air as blood trickled from his temple. A bloodied man stared in shock and disbelief while sweat dripped down his temple as he processed the impossible situation before him. The blue-haired man with glowing yellow eyes raised his hand to summon a swirling vortex of electric energy while declaring that he would handle the rest. A glowing blue holographic interface flickered with digital symbols and asked if entry into the labyrinth was desired. A violent burst of white energy exploded across the checkered floor and sent dust and debris flying through the air. A foot stomped onto the tiled floor and created a blinding flash of light that shattered the ground beneath it. A purple-haired man sprinted forward in panic as a massive monster with glowing red eyes and jagged teeth lunged behind him with extended claws and an open mouth. A young man with sharp yellow eyes and dark hair whirled around mid-motion with his mouth open in a shout as motion lines streaked the background. A muscular warrior charged down a shattered marble hallway while debris scattered across the checkered floor and purple light bled from wall-mounted lanterns. A soldier lunged backward with a weapon drawn as the monstrous beast charged forward with glowing red eyes fixed on him and jagged teeth bared in a silent roar. A young man with glowing yellow eyes raised his right hand wreathed in crackling blue energy and smirked sharply as he declared that the real show began now. A spectral white energy surge rippled across the checkered floor and cast an eerie glow against the stone walls and torches. A monstrous figure with glowing yellow eyes and jagged teeth lunged downward through rain-slicked air to smash its massive red-fisted arm into a screaming humanoid enemy midair. A young man with dark hair lunged forward while gripping a crackling red energy staff with fierce concentration as lightning arced along the weapon's length. A demonic figure with glowing red eyes and jagged teeth lunged forward while wreathed in crackling crimson energy as it charged through the air with terrifying speed. A pink-haired warrior thrust a glowing sword upward into a monstrous red creature's torso and sent blood and flesh flying as the beast recoiled in agony. A glowing blue holographic display updated the labyrinth's status to show current allies and remaining enemies, including red goblins and a steel blood orc. A young man in a dark tactical suit dove downward through the air while gripping a massive glowing red sword that crackled with electricity in grim determination. A man with dark hair watched in shock as a massive blood-drenched monster tore through enemies mid-swing, while its red aura flared violently around falling bodies. A clawed foot stomped down on the checkered floor and sent cracks and debris flying outward as a heavy impact echoed through the room. The horned demon surged forward with its red arm glowing and teeth bared in a snarl while radiating violent energy as motion lines streaked across the darkened space. A monstrous figure with glowing yellow eyes and jagged teeth snarled fiercely with its face twisted in rage as dark energy crackled around its head. The red-skinned warrior charged forward with glowing yellow eyes and a furious roar while his massive form surged through streaks of violent energy that shattered the air. A colossal stone beast with glowing yellow eyes and jagged fangs lunged forward to crush a red-armored figure midair with its massive clawed hand as blood splattered across the rain-slicked alleyway. A young man with glowing yellow eyes lunged forward through streaking purple motion lines with a fierce expression as he declared that it was finally happening while lightning crackled behind him. The hooded fighter drove his electrified fist into the ground with explosive force to send jagged cracks and sparks erupting outward as he gritted his teeth in fierce concentration. The red-skinned monster lunged forward with its massive jaws wide open to reveal rows of jagged fangs and a glowing eye as motion lines conveyed its ferocious speed toward the brick wall. A monstrous maw lined with jagged teeth lunged forward in a blur of motion to snap its gaping jaws shut with violent force as red energy crackled around its snarling visage. A masked figure with glowing red eyes and a jagged grin charged forward as crimson energy erupted from his fists, while another character leaped back in alarm above him. A system interface announced the defeat of Boss Ziziori and disabled monster respawning. A young man in a dark uniform with neon green stripes lunged forward with raised arms and an open shout to strike a massive red crystalline entity as the air crackled with kinetic energy. A leg clad in black boots and gray trousers kicked forcefully against a brick wall to send white impact bursts radiating outward as motion lines streaked across the frame. A sound effect floated over a blue-lit brick wall featuring vertical beams and glowing leaf-shaped lights. A volley of arrows streaked through the air toward a stone wall with their motion marked by sharp speed lines and impact sounds. A rock-headed figure lunged forward with a glowing blade to strike toward an unseen target as the air fractured around him in violent motion. A hooded figure in armored gear drove a spear into an unseen opponent's body to draw blood while gritting his teeth as motion lines streaked the air. A young man with dark hair gritted his teeth in pain as golden sparks erupted around his glowing yellow eyes and the air crackled with energy. A hooded fighter slashed upward with a glowing blade to cleave through the monster's torso and send blood and debris flying as the creature reeled back in agony. A heavy object crashed down with explosive force to shatter the surface beneath it in a burst of white impact sparks. A spiked ceiling trap activated with a metallic crash and plunged downward in a blur of motion as the system announced its activation. A blue-haired warrior holding a spear stood over two fallen enemies as blood splattered across the hexagonal floor thick with the aftermath of violent impact. A young man with purple hair and glowing yellow eyes stood in a dim stone corridor with a calm but alert expression as he exhaled sharply amidst faintly shimmering tension. Blood splattered across cracked tiles beneath a heavy platform anchored by thick chains that cast deep shadows over the grim scene. A young man with purple hair and golden eyes stood in a dimly lit stone room frozen in shock as a glowing blue holographic interface materialized before him displaying cryptic symbols and data. A glowing blue holographic warning display projected durability and monster count data against a brick wall background. A man in tactical gear clutched his head in distress while lamenting the loss of his gold as two red-skinned creatures celebrated wildly around him amidst swirling mist. A red-skinned demon stumbled backward in panic as the floor cracked beneath his feet, while a soldier in tactical gear stood firm holding a large weapon and declared that this was the end. A uniformed agent thrust his palm forward to blast a red lightning-wreathed monster into rubble and dust while gripping a staff with his other hand as debris flew. The demon roared with its mouth wide open and fangs bared, while red lightning crackled around its glowing eyes to radiate pure fury. A digital warning screen announced that the Steel Blood Orc was entering a berserk state as red glitch effects fractured the surrounding space. A young man with dark hair and glowing yellow eyes extended his hand to conjure a swirling blue-black portal crackling with lightning, while gritting out that this was the only way forward. The young man unleashed a swirling blue energy vortex that tore through the air toward a snarling red demon with a focused and fierce expression, as lightning crackled around the collapsing space. A long wooden corridor stretched beneath towering pillars toward distant figures on an upper balcony, bathed in warm sunlight with floating dust motes and blooming flowers visible to the side. A man in tattered robes stood trembling on a wooden veranda with crossed arms and wide eyes as the air around him vibrated with unseen force. A man in white robes stood rigid on a wooden pavilion as a swirling blue vortex erupted violently on the ground below him, crackling with lightning and distorting the air. A bloodied warrior thrust his hand forward to unleash a roaring blue vortex of lightning, with his face twisted in exertion as the air crackled with raw power. A bloodied man in a white robe stared at his trembling hand with shock and dawning horror as he demanded to know what was happening to him. A hunter in black gear clashed midair with a towering red crystalline beast while sparks flew from their colliding weapons, and an onlooker watched from below as the courtyard trembled. A monstrous red-clawed limb smashed downward with explosive force to send debris flying and shake the ground beneath it. A masked figure in dark tactical gear lunged forward with a glowing blade to strike the torso of a towering red crystalline monster that recoiled from the impact as debris scattered. A young man with glowing yellow eyes and sweat on his face panted heavily with a strained expression as he demanded to know who dared interrupt him. A dark-haired fighter thrust a spear toward the back of a massive red stone golem that filled the foreground with its armored surface crackling with energy as dust flew. A man grinned tightly while sweat dripped down his face to reveal clenched teeth as he stood before a sunlit wooden pavilion. A shirtless man with purple hair and glowing yellow eyes roared in furious exertion, while gripping a training bar with bulging veins as another version of him grinned wildly below. A massive red-eyed beast with jagged teeth and glowing crimson crystals on its chest lunged downward, with terrifying force to slam into a crouched figure clad in dark armor. A warrior in dark armor lunged forward with a glowing red sword aimed at the jagged molten red monster looming before him, while white energy flared from his motion. A jagged crimson blade wreathed in crackling energy descended through the air with violent intensity. A red-haired man lunged forward and drove a blinding explosion of lightning into an unseen target with his face twisted in exertion as arcs of electricity tore through the air. A monstrous beast with glowing red eyes and jagged fangs snarled violently, while blood sprayed from its mouth and crimson energy crackled around its armored form. A young man with glowing yellow eyes and crackling energy around his body grinned through sweat and said this was actually fun while surrounded by drifting embers under a pale sky. The young man thrust his staff into the massive red fist, bracing against the flying sparks with grim determination. A jagged, dark-armored figure lunged forward in a blur, wreathed in crackling crimson energy and overwhelming force. The red-armored warrior swung a massive blade at the crouching soldier, who braced as debris exploded around them. The soldier lunged forward and sent his opponent flying, while shouting that no one escaped alive. The purple-haired man screamed in agony as he slammed backward into the collapsing wall, his body contorted by the impact. The young man in dark armor turned his head sharply, his yellow eyes wide as dust swirled around him. Blood splattered near the shattered crimson gauntlet lying on the cracked stone after the violent impact. The colossal demon roared and charged with a raised fist, while the young man shouted he would not back down. A powerful energy slash tore through the courtyard with blinding speed, leaving a streak of motion across the frame. The man in white drove his fist into the rock-skinned monster's chest, sending shards flying as the creature snarled. The blood-streaked man snarled in furious rage and shouted that nothing would stop him now. The colossal demon loomed over the fallen man and slammed him violently into the ground amidst exploding debris. The bloodied man screamed with his mouth wide open as debris exploded outward around him in raw agony. The man lunged forward with a snarl and demanded the creature release its hold, while rain slashed across the battlefield. The masked fighter collided his fist with the red-armored opponent's chest, sending shockwaves rippling through the air. A skeletal beast with a glowing red eye lunged forward, its form distorted by violent motion against a crimson backdrop. The masked figure leaped midair wreathed in red lightning as jagged shadows surged upward from below. The cloaked figure lunged forward with a clenched fist, their single glowing eye radiating violent intent amid surging red energy. The man screamed as a massive toothed maw descended to devour him, his eyes glowing white against the crimson background. The monstrous figure with jagged spikes lunged forward in a blur, its mouth twisted in a snarl as red energy erupted. An unseen force slashed the man in the dark suit across the torso, causing blood to spray as his body twisted. The crimson-armored figure propelled backward through the air with blood erupting from its torso, while a smaller combatant soared away. The fighter lunged forward with an extended blade, striking the monstrous red creature's torso and drawing blood as it recoiled. A glowing blue system notification announced the acquisition of a unique grade item called Demonic Dagger. A skeletal horned skull with jagged teeth and bloodstains rested motionless amid dark red fabric, staring blankly into the void. The purple-haired young man gripped his shoulder and declared he was ready to move on to the next stage of training. The battered character lay on the cracked ground with bloodied eyes wide open, frozen in shock and pain. The wounded man lay against broken stone with blood streaking his face and a dazed gaze fixed upward. The wounded firefighter collapsed against the wooden wall, gasping in pain while reaching out as if begging for help. The battered man in the torn white robe recoiled with wide, bloodied eyes as the armored figure loomed over him. The bloodied man looked up with a weary expression and spoke from his position against the stone wall. The bloodied young man with glowing yellow eyes stared forward in stunned silence, bearing the marks of recent violence. The black-clad agent dragged the wounded white-suited man across the blood-slicked floor, while comrades stood guard over the fallen. The bureau headquarters rose starkly against the sky, its white facade and vertical windows dominating the frame. The woman held a small black device with a calm expression, while the crowd around her reacted with surprise. 3 men stood outdoors with phones on tripods, their expressions frozen in shock as the blond man demanded what happened. The silver-haired man buttoned his jacket with a stern expression while photographers snapped pictures and his bodyguards stood alert. The silver-haired man strode forward through a swarm of reporters, while his assistant raised a hand to block the chaotic crowd. The character stepped forward onto the tiled floor with a sharp tap and began to say they would do something first. The elderly man grimaced in pain as he looked down at the handheld radio device and spoke into the microphone. The young man turned his head with wide eyes toward the silver-haired figure, startled by the unexpected presence. One of the young men in matching hoodies turned his head to ask if he was being addressed while others stood tense. The purple-haired man stood rigid with sweat trickling down his temple, staring forward in tense silence as radio equipment hummed. The brown-haired man supported the purple-haired youth and stated he had to get to work as they walked through the busy area. The young man with purple hair turned his head sharply and raised an arm as if to block an incoming threat. The man with yellow eyes stood in the foreground while the shocked man behind him demanded to know what he was doing. The purple-haired man stared forward in sharp focus while the brown-haired man behind him grimaced with visible strain. The reporter thrust a phone on a selfie stick toward the suited man and demanded an answer with desperate urgency. The man in the gray uniform tilted his head back and let out a low sigh that hung heavy in the air. The brown-haired man grabbed the purple-haired man's shoulder and demanded where he was going while the latter smirked and raised a finger. The purple-haired man snatched a phone from an extended selfie stick, causing the heavyset reporter to flinch as the crowd surged. The man in the high-collared blue coat smirked with his mouth slightly open, conveying an air of hidden amusement. The red-haired man screamed in fury while leaning over the sweating person and demanding if it felt good to get paid. A giant hand pointed down at the defiant silver-haired man, who shouted that he was the shit as onlookers froze. 3 young men stared forward with shocked expressions, while the man in front stood frozen under their terrified attention. The young man with sharp yellow eyes tilted his head slightly and smirked as he said something confident or teasing. The elderly man with one glowing red eye smirked confidently, his wrinkled face relaxed in amusement as he observed something off-panel. A hand yanked the boy's hair violently, causing him to scream in pain with his eyes rolled back. The man in the red plaid shirt swung a selfie stick to launch 2 guards into the air, while a silver-haired onlooker shouted for him to wait. The man in the gray suit winced with his eyes shut as if groaning in pain, while another man stood behind him. The man with white hair leaned over a seated subordinate who bowed his head and responded affirmatively in quiet obedience. The elderly man with long white hair and glowing red eyes snarled in rage, his face twisted with fury as crimson energy radiated. A dark blue sign reading Kohuyusi Enus hung from a white ceiling bracket in a sterile, empty hallway. The man in the red plaid shirt stared forward with his mouth agape and pointed at the screen displaying the video timestamp. The man in the blue suit gestured toward a holographic display and insisted this case required special handling while addressing 2 seated individuals. The man pressed his hand to his forehead and sighed that he could not handle this anymore, his expression strained with exhaustion. The man slammed his fist on the table and pointed upward while demanding to know where something was as a woman watched silently. The man in the gray and green uniform stared upward with a tense expression, his jaw set as if bracing for confrontation. The man with long blonde hair stood with arms crossed and a smug expression, saying he would handle everything himself. The man in the tracksuit leaned over the table and spoke urgently, while the seated blonde man demanded whether they were unaware of something. A clenched fist pressed into the snow, knuckles straining under tension as cold air shimmered around it. The blonde man lunged forward and jabbed his finger aggressively at a seated colleague, shouting that the project was an absolute disaster. A man in a hoodie sat at a table, while two suited men stood near a window with their backs turned. The man with brown hair and a blue hooded jacket opened his mouth to speak with a serious expression. The blonde man in the dark suit stood with his back turned, holding a cup of coffee while gazing out at the city skyline. The man with slick-back blonde hair spoke with a tense expression, while another man stood behind him with arms crossed. The bearded man lifted a green cup to his lips and took a slow sip, his expression calm and unreadable. Park Kwang-soo exhaled steam from his coffee cup and declared that they should respond accordingly, his expression stern and resolute.